The restaurant had that kind of silence that makes your ears ring. You know the one I'm talking about. When everyone stopped mid-bite, forks frozen halfway to mouths, and all eyes are locked on you. My son David stood at the head of the table, his wine glass raised like he was about to give a toast. But what came out of his mouth wasn't gratitude or love. "Mom," he said, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear, "I want to make something clear to everyone here. You're not getting anything from me. Not financial support, not a place in my family decisions, not even a mention in my will. You've had your time. This is my life now." I remember the weight of the fork in my hand, the way the candlelight flickered across his face, making him look like a stranger. The cool metal felt heavier than it should have, like it was anchoring me to this moment, forcing me to stay present when every instinct screamed to flee. My daughter-in-law Sarah sat beside him, her expression carefully blank, not shocked, not embarrassed. She'd known. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. They'd rehearsed this. My granddaughter Annie stared at her plate, her young face burning red. I could see her shoulders trembling slightly, and I wanted to reach across the table to comfort her, but I couldn't move. The air conditioning in the restaurant suddenly felt too cold, raising goosebumps on my arms despite my cardigan. I could smell the garlic butter from someone's lobster at a nearby table, sickeningly rich. And me? I smiled. I actually smiled and took a sip of water like he'd just told me the weather forecast. The ice cubes clinked against the glass as my hand shook, just slightly. I watched a drop of condensation slide down the side of the glass, focused on that single bead of water because it was easier than looking at my son's face. Because 3 months earlier, I'd already started to see the truth. And tonight, in this overpriced steakhouse in downtown Phoenix, was just confirmation of what I'd been too scared to admit. The violinist who'd been playing near the bar had stopped. Even the staff had frozen, pretending to arrange silverware while their eyes darted toward our table. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not tonight. Earlier. To when I still believed in fairy tales. I'm Margaret Chen, 58 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I'd done everything right. I raised David as a single mother after his father walked out when he was 6. I still remember that day, coming home from my shift at the diner to find a note on the kitchen counter and half the closet empty. David had been at his friend's house, spared from witnessing his father's cowardice in real time. I'd hidden the note before picking him up, plastered on a smile, and told him Daddy had to go away for work. It would be months before I told him the truth. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to make sure he had everything he needed. I worked morning shifts at the hospital cafeteria, smelling like industrial disinfectant and reheated gravy. Then I'd change in my car and head to the diner for the evening rush, my feet already aching in shoes I couldn't afford to replace. Some nights, I'd come home and do data entry for a medical billing company until 2 in the morning, my eyes burning from the computer screen. Piano lessons. I'd sit in my car during David's lessons, using that 30 minutes to pay bills or sometimes just close my eyes and breathe. Summer camps. I'd take extra shifts in June and July, missing the sunshine entirely, so he could spend 2 weeks learning archery and making friendship bracelets at Camp Pine Ridge. A college education at Arizona State without a single dollar of student debt. I was so proud of that. So proud of him. I remember the day he graduated, May 2015, the desert heat already baking the football field where the ceremony was held. I'd worn my nicest dress, the same navy blue one I'd eventually wear to my birthday dinner 5 years later, and my feet swelled in dress shoes I wasn't used to wearing. But when David's name was called and he walked across that stage, diploma in hand, I cried. Not polite tears, but the kind that make your whole body shake. The woman next to me, some other proud parent, had handed me tissues and patted my shoulder. She didn't know those tears were relief, pure, exhausting relief that I'd done it. I'd gotten him to the finish line. By the time David turned 30, he'd started his own consulting firm. My boy, the entrepreneur. He'd found a tiny office space in Tempe, and I'd helped him paint the walls on weekends, my lower back screaming from the repetitive motion. We'd ordered pizza and talked about his dreams, how he wanted to build something meaningful, something that would make a difference. I'd believed every word. He'd married Sarah, a woman who smiled with all her teeth but never with her eyes, and they'd given me a granddaughter who looked just like I did at 15, all wild curls and sharp questions. I'd first met Sarah at a company mixer David had invited me to. She'd shaken my hand with a grip that was just a fraction too tight, her smile just a fraction too wide. "David talks about you constantly," she'd said. At the time, I'd taken it as a compliment. Looking back, I wonder what exactly he'd been saying. I lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Scottsdale, the same house where David grew up. It had a backyard with a lemon tree I planted the year he was born. I'd bought that sapling from a nursery on Thomas Road, carried it home in the passenger seat of my beat-up Honda, and dug the hole myself on a Sunday afternoon while David napped. That tree had grown with him, scraggly and uncertain at first, then stronger, reaching toward the Arizona sky. Every spring it produced more lemons than I could use, and I'd make lemon bars, lemon chicken, lemonade. The neighbors joked that my whole life smelled like citrus. I'd paid off the mortgage just before I turned 50, and I remember thinking I'd finally made it. Security, stability, a home that was truly mine. I'd made the last payment online, printed out the confirmation, and then sat at my kitchen table and cried for the second time in my adult life. The first had been at David's graduation. This time, I was crying for myself. For the 25 years of payments I'd never missed, for every sacrifice that led to this moment of owning something completely. But then David's business hit what he called a cash flow problem. He came to me on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and projections, and asked if I'd be willing to help. Not with a small loan, with everything. The table between us was the same one where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd eaten countless dinners, just the two of us against the world. The surface was scarred from years of use, a burn mark from a pot I'd set down too quickly, a dent from when David had pounded it with a toy truck at age 4. My fingers traced that dent while he talked numbers I barely understood. "I need about 200,000 to keep things afloat and expand," he said, running his fingers through his hair the way he used to when he was stressed about exams. That gesture was so familiar it hurt. "If we don't act now, we'll lose momentum. Mom, this could set us up for life, all of us. All of us." I'd held on to those words like a lifeline. I looked at my son's face and saw that 6-year-old boy who'd cried in my lap when his father left. I saw every sacrifice I'd made, every missed dinner, every time I'd chosen his future over my present, and I thought, this is what it was all for. This moment, where I could actually help him build something lasting. "How would it work?" I'd asked, my voice small. I didn't understand finance. I'd barely managed my own checking account most of my life, living paycheck to paycheck for so long that budgeting meant deciding which bills to pay late. "We'd take out a home equity loan on the house," David explained, his words smooth and practiced. I wonder now how many times he'd rehearsed this speech. "The house is worth about 300,000. We can borrow against that equity. I'll make the payments, of course. You won't have to worry about anything. And once the business is profitable, we're projecting 18 months. I'll pay it all back with interest. You'll actually come out ahead, Mom." I'd wanted to believe him so badly. Can you understand that? When you love someone that much, when you've built your entire identity around being their mother, their supporter, their foundation, you want to believe. You need to believe. I took out a home equity loan, $215,000 to be exact, nearly everything my house was worth. The loan officer at the bank had looked at me with concern. "Mrs. Chen," he'd said, his young face earnest, "this is a significant loan. Have you consulted with a financial advisor? Do you have a backup plan if the payments become difficult?" I'd smiled at him, this kid who was maybe 25, and said, My son will handle it. It's for his business. The officer had nodded slowly, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. He'd probably seen this before, but he couldn't stop me. I was signing my own future away, and it was perfectly legal. David promised it was temporary, just until the business stabilized. He'd pay me back with interest within 2 years. We even had it in writing, though I felt guilty asking for that. Like I didn't trust my own son. I remember his slight flinch when I mentioned getting the agreement in writing. "Of course, Mom," he'd said. "Whatever makes you comfortable, though I'm a little hurt you think you need it in writing." That small guilt trip should have been a warning sign. But I'd apologized for protecting myself. The business did stabilize. In fact, it took off. Within a year, David had moved his family from their rental apartment to a 4-bedroom house in Paradise Valley, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Phoenix. I'd driven by it once, slowly, trying to take in the enormous iron gates. The perfectly manicured lawn that stayed green even in August, the fountain in the circular driveway. My house could have fit in their garage. New cars appeared in their driveway, a Tesla for David, a Range Rover for Sarah. Vacation photos from Italy and Japan flooded Sarah's social media, which I checked compulsively, even though every post felt like a small stab to my chest. Pictures of them at the Colosseum, at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Tokyo, Annie in a gondola in Venice, her smile bright and genuine in a way it never was anymore when I saw her. I was happy for them. I really was. Even when my own financial situation got tighter and tighter, I told myself it was worth it. When I had to start buying generic brands at the grocery store, I thought about David's success. When I had to cancel my cable and rely on the library's free Wi-Fi for internet, I told myself this was temporary. He'd pay me back. He promised. But something had shifted in David. Or maybe it had always been there, and I'd just been too blinded by love to see it. He started making decisions about my life without consulting me. Small things at first. He'd tell me he'd arranged for a handyman to fix my fence, then get annoyed when I said I'd already hired someone. "I'm just trying to help, Mom. Why do you have to be so stubborn?" As if maintaining my own home was an act of defiance rather than basic independence. I remember the fence incident clearly. I'd hired Miguel, a handyman who'd been doing odd jobs in the neighborhood for years. He charged fair prices and did solid work. But David had called some company, probably the same one that maintained his Paradise Valley estate, and they'd shown up unannounced, confused when I turned them away. David had called me that evening, his voice tight with frustration. "I was trying to do something nice for you, and you threw it in my face." "I didn't throw anything," I'd said, my stomach knotting. "I just already had someone. You didn't ask me first." I shouldn't have to ask permission to help my own mother. But it wasn't about helping, it was about control. I understand that now. Then came the bigger things. He suggested I should sell the house and move into a senior living community. I was 56 at the time, healthy, active, still working part-time at the library because I enjoyed it, because I liked the smell of books and the quiet conversations with regular patrons who knew me by name. "It's just more practical," Sarah chimed in during one family dinner at their house. We were sitting in their dining room, which was bigger than my entire first floor, crystal chandelier overhead, china that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security. Those places have medical staff on site. At your age, you never know what might happen. At your age, I was 56, not 86. I'd run a 5K just 3 months earlier. I could still do yoga, still garden, still live independently without assistance. But the way Sarah said it, with that particular tone of concern that was really condescension, made me feel ancient, decrepit, like I was already one fall away from being a burden. I laughed it off then, but I remember the look that passed between David and Sarah, like they'd already discussed this, like they'd already made plans that involved my life but didn't include my input. Sarah's hand had moved to David's under the table. I saw it, the way her fingers squeezed his, the small nod he gave her. They were in sync, united, and I was the problem they were solving together. I know what you're thinking. You're yelling at me through your screen right now. Margaret, wake up, see what's happening. And you're right, I should have. But here's the thing about betrayal from someone you love. It doesn't arrive like a home invasion, loud and violent. It creeps in like carbon monoxide, silent, invisible, deadly. And by the time you realize you can't breathe, you're already poisoned. I believed in reciprocity. That's what kept me anchored in denial. I'd given David everything, so surely he'd give me at least respect in return. I'd sacrificed my comfort, my security, my entire adult life to raise him right. That had to count for something, didn't it? That belief was my blind spot, and it almost destroyed me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the birthday dinner that wasn't really about my birthday at all. David had insisted on taking me to Bourbon Steak, this upscale place where appetizers cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. Nothing but the best for my mom, he'd said when he made the reservation. The way he said it should have tipped me off, performative, like he was saying it for someone else's benefit, even though we were alone on the phone. I'd worn my nicest dress, the navy blue one I saved for special occasions. It was getting a bit loose. I'd lost weight from stress, though I told myself it was just eating healthier. Annie had even helped me with my makeup earlier that day, her young hands gentle as she applied blush to my cheeks. "You look beautiful, Grandma," she'd said, but her eyes were sad. She knew something. I realize that now. She'd been trying to prepare me, in her own way. The restaurant was all dark wood and soft lighting, the kind of place where waiters materialize silently at your elbow and wine lists are leather-bound and intimidating. We'd made it through the salad course, some arrangement of microgreens and candied pecans that cost $18, when David stood up. I thought maybe he was going to the restroom. Instead, he cleared his throat and launched into his announcement, the one about how I'd get nothing from him. Sarah's hand went to his arm, but not to stop him, to steady him, to support him. Her fingers curled around his forearm, and she looked up at him with something like pride. She was proud of him for this, for publicly humiliating his mother on her birthday. My granddaughter looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her napkin was twisted in her hands, nearly shredded, and the other diners, strangers celebrating their own moments, became unwilling witnesses to my humiliation. I could feel their eyes, their discomfort, the way conversations at nearby tables stuttered and died. When David finally sat down, the waiter appeared with our entrees as if nothing had happened, as if my son hadn't just publicly severed whatever remained of our relationship over a $60 steak. The waiter's hands didn't shake as he placed the plates. He'd probably seen worse. Or maybe he was just very good at his job. I cut into my filet mignon. The knife slid through the meat easily, medium rare, just as I'd ordered, though I couldn't remember ordering it. Chewed. The food tasted like nothing, like I was eating expensive cardboard. Swallowed. Smiled when Annie asked if I liked it, though my cheeks hurt from holding the expression. I was performing normalcy while everything inside me screamed. But here's what David didn't know. 3 months before that dinner, I'd already started to see the truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It started with a woman in the produce section at Trader Joe's. I was squeezing avocados, trying to find ones that were ripe but not overripe, when this stranger approached me. She was about 40, wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and holding a basket full of organic vegetables. Everything about her screamed Paradise Valley. The highlights in her hair, the diamond tennis bracelet, the way she stood with the casual confidence of someone who'd never worried about money. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you Margaret Chen?" I didn't recognize her, but I smiled anyway. Years of customer service had trained that response into me. "Yes, that's me." "I thought so. I saw your picture at David's business launch party last year. You must be so proud of what he's achieved since taking over your home." The avocado in my hand suddenly felt like a stone, cold, heavy. My fingers tightened around it, and I felt the skin give slightly under the pressure. "I'm sorry, what?" She looked confused, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. Your house? The one in Scottsdale? David mentioned during his speech that it was the foundation of his success. Literally, he said, since he used it as collateral for the business expansion. I just thought it was so generous of you to let him... She stopped, her face paling as she registered my expression. Oh God, you didn't know, did you? The fluorescent lights of the grocery store suddenly seemed too bright. I could hear the muzak playing overhead, some instrumental version of a song I should have recognized. A child was crying somewhere in the store. Shopping carts rattled past us. Life continued normally while mine stopped. I wanted to tell her she was mistaken, that my son wouldn't do that. That the loan had been against my equity, yes, but I still owned the house. The deed was still in my name. It had to be. I'd never signed it over. I would have remembered that. But something in the way she looked at me, with this mix of pity and horror, told me she wasn't wrong. She'd been there. She'd heard David say it. My son had stood in front of his business associates and clients and claimed my house as his foundation, as his achievement. I'm so sorry, she whispered. And then she hurried away, leaving me standing there with an avocado in one hand and my entire world crumbling around me. I don't remember paying for my groceries. I know I did. I found the receipt later, but I have no memory of the checkout process, of driving home, of anything, until I was sitting in my car in my driveway, staring at my house, like I'd never seen it before. I drove home in a daze, pulled into my driveway, looked at my house, my lemon tree, my mailbox with M. Chen painted on the side. Everything looked the same, but something felt different. Like when you come home after vacation and can't shake the feeling that someone's been there. The familiar had become foreign. This place that held every memory of raising David, that I'd bled for and sacrificed for. Did it even belong to me anymore? I went through my files that night. Every document, every piece of paper related to the loan. I had them in an accordion folder in my home office, really just the third bedroom with a desk and filing cabinet. I spread everything across the desk, my hands shaking as I read through page after page of legal language I didn't fully understand. And that's when I found it, buried in the small print of an amendment I'd signed 6 months prior, thinking it was just a routine refinancing update. David had brought it over one evening, casual, mentioned the bank needed updated paperwork. I'd signed it at my kitchen table while he made small talk about Annie's school play. I'd trusted him. Transfer of deed upon default. Those 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words buried in paragraph 12 of a document I'd signed without reading carefully because my son told me it was fine. I'd defaulted on 2 payments during a particularly rough month when the library cut my hours. David had said not to worry, that he'd cover it, that we'd work it out. I'd trusted him, and in doing so, I'd signed away my home. The house wasn't mine anymore. It was his. I sat at my kitchen table until sunrise, staring at those papers. The lemon tree was visible through the window, its fruit bright even in the darkness. I'd watered that tree for 32 years. I'd pruned it, fertilized it, protected it from frost on cold desert nights. And now it belonged to someone else. I'd built my entire adult life around the belief that sacrifice equals love. That if you give enough, care enough, do enough, you'll be valued in return, protected, cherished. But I'd confused transaction for relationship, and my son had been happy to let me. The thing about financial betrayal is that it's intimate in a way physical violence isn't. Someone has to know you deeply to manipulate you this thoroughly. They have to understand your vulnerabilities, your blind spots, your desperate need to believe in them. David knew I'd sign anything he put in front of me because I trusted him, because mothers aren't supposed to question their children's intentions. And now I was 58 years old, living in a house that belonged to my son, with no savings, no security, and apparently no place in his future. You know what the worst part was? I still made excuses for him in my head. Maybe he'd planned to tell me. Maybe Sarah pushed him into it. Maybe I'd misread the documents. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding that we could clear up with one honest conversation. Maybe. That's what love does. It makes you defend the person hurting you. I started tracking everything after that. Every conversation, every financial transaction, every casual comment about my future that I'd previously dismissed. I bought a small notebook, a cheap spiral-bound one from the drugstore, and wrote it all down because I knew my memory could play tricks on me, gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. The notebook became my lifeline. Blue ink, my handwriting getting messier as the entries became more painful. May 3rd. David called, mentioned I should think about simplifying my life. May 10th. Sarah asked about my Social Security amount, said it was for family planning purposes. May 15th. Found another bank statement showing payment made on loan I didn't authorize. 3 weeks after the grocery store encounter, David called to tell me he and Sarah wanted to help me downsize. They'd found a lovely assisted living facility called Desert Blooms. It had shuffleboard and weekly bingo nights, only $2,300 a month. He texted me the brochure while we were still on the phone. Glossy photos of elderly people playing cards, arranged activities, smiling staff members. "We'll cover the first few months," David said, his voice dripping with generosity, "just until you figure out your finances." My finances. The finances he'd destroyed. "What about my house?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. I was learning to control my tone, to not reveal how much I was starting to understand. "What about it?" "I still live here, David." A pause. Then, "Mom, we've been over this. The house is part of the business assets now. It's too much for you to maintain anyway. You said so yourself last year." I'd never said that, but contradicting him would make me the difficult one, the ungrateful mother who couldn't appreciate her son's concern. So I said, "Let me think about it." "Don't think too long," he replied, and I could hear the edge creeping into his voice. "Desert Blooms has a waiting list." The implication was clear. I was lucky they were even offering this. I should be grateful. I should jump at the chance to leave my home and move into an assisted living facility at 58 so my son could liquidate his asset. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the same bed I'd slept in for 30 years, the same bed where I'd comforted David through nightmares and illnesses, where I'd cried myself to sleep after his father left. And I kept thinking about all the years I'd poured into David. The night shifts at the hospital cafeteria so he could have new shoes. Not just any shoes, but the ones the other kids had, so he wouldn't be teased. The community college courses I'd postponed, then eventually abandoned completely because his tuition came first. I'd wanted to be a paralegal. I'd completed 1 semester before his father left, and I'd loved it. But that dream got shelved, then buried, then forgotten. The relationships I'd never pursued because I was too tired, too busy, too focused on being a good mother. There had been a man once, Robert. He'd worked maintenance at the hospital and used to bring me coffee during my breakfast shift. He'd asked me out 3 times. I'd said no because David had soccer practice, because David had a school project, because David needed me. What had it all been for? To end up warehoused in a facility with shuffleboard while my son lived in luxury built on my sacrifice? I later learned that 1 in 10 Americans over 60 experiences some form of elder abuse. 1 in 10. I was part of a statistic I'd never imagined I'd belong to. And the most common perpetrators aren't strangers or caregivers. They're family members, sons, daughters, people you'd trust with your life who decide your assets are more valuable than your dignity. When I read that statistic on a website late one night, my laptop balanced on my knees, I'd felt this strange mix of validation and devastation. I wasn't alone, but that meant so many others were suffering too. When I read that, I stopped feeling ashamed. I was not crazy. I was not ungrateful. I was being systematically pushed aside by the person I'd loved most in the world. and something inside me shifted. From confusion to clarity, from grief to cold, focused anger. But I still wasn't ready to act. Not yet. Because there was one more piece I needed to understand. One more betrayal that would finally break through my paralysis. It came at Easter dinner. Sarah had insisted on hosting at their Paradise Valley house. I'd brought my famous lemon bars, made from lemons off the tree I still foolishly thought of as mine. The irony wasn't lost on me, baking with fruit from a tree I'd planted, in a yard I'd tended, on property I no longer owned. Annie had helped me carry them in, her hand squeezing mine in a way that felt like solidarity, like she was trying to tell me something without words. The house was decorated beautifully. Fresh flowers in crystal vases, pastel Easter eggs in expensive ceramic bowls, a table set with linens that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Everything was perfect. Everything was a performance. We just sat down to eat when Sarah made an announcement. "We have some exciting news," she said, beaming at David. "We're selling the Scottsdale property. We've already got a buyer lined up, and the proceeds will fund David's expansion into the California market. The Scottsdale property, my home, reduced to real estate jargon, like it was just another asset on a spreadsheet instead of the place where I'd raised my son, where I'd planted a lemon tree, where I'd built a life from nothing." I felt my body shut down, not metaphorically, literally. My hands went numb, fingers tingling like I'd been sitting on them. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room going dark until I was looking down a long corridor at Sarah's smiling face. The voices around the table became distant and muffled, like I was underwater, like I was drowning while everyone ate ham and scalloped potatoes. I was having what I'd later learn was a dissociative episode, my brain's way of protecting me from a reality too painful to process. "Grandma," Annie's voice cut through the fog. "Grandma, are you okay?" I wasn't okay. I would never be okay again in the way I'd been before. But I nodded, smiled, said something about being tired, about the heat, about needing to lie down for a minute. Let Annie walk me to the guest room where I lay down, staring at the ceiling, while my son and his wife celebrated selling my life out from under me. The guest room was decorated in beige and cream, impersonal as a hotel. I could hear them through the walls, their voices carrying. Sarah's laugh. David talking about projected profits. Someone mentioned the California office would be in San Diego, near the water. My house was becoming a beach view for my son's business expansion. That was my collapse symbol. That moment when my body physically could not continue pretending everything was fine. When the weight of the betrayal became too heavy for even my practiced denial to bear. I lay there for an hour, maybe more. And then Annie came in. She closed the door softly behind her and sat on the edge of the bed. Even in my daze, I noticed how careful she was, how she moved like someone who'd learned to be quiet, invisible, unobtrusive. What had she witnessed in this house? What had she learned about family from watching her parents? "Grandma," she said, her 15-year-old voice steady and sure. "I know what they're doing to you, and it's not okay." I started to deflect, to make excuses, but she held up her hand. That gesture was so adult, so certain, that it shocked me into silence. "No, stop protecting him. He's stealing from you, he's using you, and Mom's helping him." She pulled out her phone. "I've been documenting things. Conversations I've overheard, text messages I accidentally saw. I think you need to see them." My granddaughter, barely old enough to drive, had been building a case file against her own father, to protect me. While I'd been making excuses and swallowing my doubts, this child had been seeing the truth clearly. I cried then, not gentle tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere I'd kept locked away for years. Decades, maybe. I cried for my lost house, for my stolen security, for the son I thought I'd raised who'd become someone I didn't recognize. I cried for the version of myself who'd believed sacrifice would be honored. And Annie held me, this child I'd watched grow up, who'd somehow become braver than I'd ever been. "You deserve better," she whispered, "and I'm going to help you fight for it." In that moment, something fundamental changed. I was no longer alone. I had an ally. And more importantly, I had proof that I wasn't the problem, that my perception wasn't skewed, that this was real and it was wrong, and I had every right to be furious. Annie showed me everything that night, screenshots of David and Sarah discussing how to manage Mom's expectations about desert blooms. Text messages where Sarah complained I was being difficult about leaving their house, how they planned to use my Social Security to offset the cost of assisted living, essentially having me pay for my own displacement. How Sarah had suggested they could probably get me to sign over power of attorney if they framed it as family planning. One text from Sarah to David particularly gutted me. "Your mother needs to understand this isn't her decision to make. We've been more than generous giving her this much time." Generous, giving me time, in my own home. They'd turned me into a problem to be solved, an asset to be liquidated, an inconvenience to be managed. I went home that night, walked into my kitchen, and stood in front of the lemon tree visible through the window. The fruit glowed in the darkness, and I thought about all the years I'd tended this tree, this house, this life. And I made a decision. I was going to fight. Not for the house, necessarily. I'd already accepted that might be lost. But for my dignity. For my right to make my own choices. For the truth to be spoken out loud instead of whispered behind closed doors. I hired a lawyer the next week. Her name was Patricia Martinez, and she specialized in elder financial abuse. I'd found her through an internet search at the library. I didn't want the search history on my home computer, paranoid that somehow David would see it. She was fierce and focused, with silver hair she wore in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her office was in a modest building in central Phoenix, nothing fancy, but the walls were covered with thank you cards from former clients. "Your case is strong," she told me after reviewing Annie's evidence and my documentation. We sat across from each other in her office, afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "But I need you to understand something. This will get ugly. Your son will feel attacked. Your daughter-in-law will circle the wagons. You might lose more than money. You might lose the relationship entirely." I looked at her across her desk, with its framed law degree and family photos, her with people who I assumed were her children, grandchildren, a life built on what looked like genuine love, and I said, "I already lost the relationship. I just didn't know it yet." We spent the next 3 months building a case. Patricia filed motions, requested documents, deposed David and Sarah, whose lawyer painted me as a confused elderly woman suffering from memory issues. They actually tried to argue that I'd willingly given David the house and was now experiencing regret combined with age-related cognitive decline. "Mrs. Chen has always been forgetful," David testified, his voice sad, performative. I read the deposition transcript later, my hands shaking with rage. "I think the stress of maintaining the house became too much, and rather than admit she needed help, she's rewriting history." Rewriting history. As if 32 years of home ownership, of mortgage payments, of maintenance and care could be erased by his lies. The legal system moved like molasses. Every victory was small and hard-won. Every setback felt devastating. But I kept going because Annie was watching. Because other women were watching. Because I needed to prove to myself that I was worth fighting for. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia had scheduled a settlement conference at David's office, neutral territory, where we could try to resolve things without going to trial. I walked into that glass and steel building, took the elevator to the 7th floor, and entered a conference room that screamed success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Camelback Mountain, leather chairs that probably cost thousands of dollars each, a table that probably cost more than my entire year's salary at the library. Everything in this building had been bought with my security, my sacrifice, my home. David sat at one end, his lawyer beside him, a man in an expensive suit whose retainer alone probably exceeded my yearly income. Sarah was there too, her arms crossed, her expression hard. She wore a designer dress and heels that clicked authoritatively when she'd walked in. They looked at me like I was the villain in this story, like I was the one who'd betrayed them. Patricia started with the evidence. The paper trail showing how David had systematically taken control of my assets, the testimony from Annie about the conversation she'd overheard, the financial expert's analysis showing that David's business expansion had been funded almost entirely by my home equity. Every piece was damning. Every document told a story of systematic exploitation. With each piece of evidence, I watched David's face, waiting for remorse, for recognition, for some flicker of the boy I'd raised who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on ants, who'd nursed an injured bird back to health when he was 12, who'd hugged me so tight after his college graduation and said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." But all I saw was annoyance, frustration, and underneath it all, a cold certainty that he was entitled to what he'd taken. To him, this wasn't theft. This was his inheritance claimed early. This was payment for being my son. "Mom," he finally said, leaning forward, "I don't understand why you're doing this. Everything I did was for the family, for our future. You're making me look like a criminal when all I've done is try to build something lasting." "With my house," I said quietly, "my security, my future." "You weren't using it. You could barely afford the utilities." "Because you took all my money." The words echoed in the conference room. Sarah's lawyer cleared his throat. Patricia made a note on her legal pad, and David just stared at me like I'd slapped him. "I gave you everything," I continued, my voice shaking but steady. Years of held-back words poured out. "And you took what little I had left and convinced yourself it was generosity. You made me homeless while buying yourself a swimming pool. You discussed putting me in assisted living while planning vacations to Europe. And you did it all while telling yourself you were the good son, the dutiful son, the son who cared." "I do care," David said, and for a moment, just a moment, he almost looked like he believed it. Like he'd truly convinced himself that what he'd done was love. "No," I said. "You care about what I can provide. That's different." The settlement conference ended with no settlement. David's lawyer advised him to prepare for trial. Patricia told me to prepare for a long fight. And I walked out of that building knowing that whatever happened legally, I'd already lost my son. But here's the thing about betrayal this deep. It doesn't heal. It scars over. And sometimes that scar tissue is stronger than what was there before. The trial never happened. Not because we settled, but because I dropped the case. I know that sounds like defeat, but let me explain. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I was sitting with Patricia in her office, going over our strategy for the upcoming deposition. And I realized something profound. I could spend the next year fighting for a house I no longer wanted. Every room held memories that were now poisoned. The kitchen where David had asked for the loan. The living room where we'd celebrated his successes. The backyard with the lemon tree that would always remind me of what I'd lost. I could pour my remaining energy into a legal battle that would consume whatever peace I had left. Or I could walk away, not in defeat, in liberation. "He keeps the house," I told Patricia. "He keeps everything. But I want it all on record. I want a judge to officially acknowledge what happened. I want the truth documented in a court filing that exists forever. I don't want money. I want the story told right." Patricia looked at me like I was crazy at first. Then she understood. She drafted a statement for the court outlining the entire betrayal, every detail, every manipulation, every lie. David's lawyer tried to block it, filing motion after motion, but the judge allowed it as part of my voluntary withdrawal of the suit. So legally, David won. He kept my house. He kept his business. He kept his reputation in his social circles. But there's a court document out there, public record, case number FC 2019-008847, that tells the truth about how he built his empire. Anyone who searches his name in connection with legal filings will find it. The truth preserved forever. I found peace in that. Not the peace of justice served, but the peace of truth spoken. Of refusing to participate in my own erasure. Annie was furious when I told her. We met at a coffee shop halfway between Phoenix and Flagstaff, where I'd already started making plans to move. She'd driven up on a Saturday morning, her car filled with boxes of things she'd secretly rescued from my house before David could sell it. Photo albums, some of my mother's jewelry, the recipe box with my grandmother's handwriting. "Grandma, we had him! We could have made him pay!" Her young face was flushed with anger, with the certainty of someone who still believed the system worked. "Baby," I said, holding her hands across the coffee shop table. "He already paid. He lost the one thing he can never get back. He lost me." And it was true. In some ways. Dropping the case was the most powerful thing I could have done. It said, "You aren't worth my energy anymore. You aren't worth my time, my stress, my remaining years. I would rather have nothing and be free than fight you for scraps of what you stole." Did you know that medical costs can increase by $5,000 in the year following abuse? 5,000. Because the stress doesn't just wound your heart, it attacks your body, your immune system, your ability to sleep, to eat, to function. I'd lost weight, 23 pounds in 6 months. My blood pressure was through the roof, requiring medication I could barely afford. I'd developed stress-related digestive issues that had me living on antacids and bland food. The financial cost of what David did wasn't just the house. It was my health, my peace of mind. Years of my life I'd spend recovering from the damage. But I refused to let him take my future too. Do you think that was fair? That he kept everything while I walked away with nothing but my dignity? Tell me in the comments, because I still wonder sometimes if I should have fought harder. If peace was worth the price I paid for it. 6 months after I dropped the lawsuit, I moved to Flagstaff. A friend from my library days, Joyce, who'd retired 5 years earlier, had a mother-in-law suite she was willing to rent to me for almost nothing. $500 a month, utilities included. It's small. Just a bedroom, a kitchenette, and a bathroom. But it has a window that looks out onto pine trees, and the air smells clean in a way Phoenix never did. Cold, sharp, honest. Like starting over. I started over. Not in the dramatic movie sense, but in the quiet, daily sense. I got a part-time job at a local bookstore called the Book Nook. It pays minimum wage, but I get an employee discount and first dibs on new arrivals. I work 4 days a week, shelving books and helping customers find their next favorite story. It's peaceful in a way my old life never was. I joined a book club that meets every other Tuesday at the library. We're reading Educated by Tara Westover this month. The parallels aren't lost on me. A woman having to choose between family and self-preservation. We sit in a circle, 8 women ranging from their 30s to their 70s, and we talk about books, but also about life. They know my story. I told them early on, testing whether they'd judge me. Instead, they surrounded me. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other survivors navigate the systems that had almost broken me. I work with a social worker there, helping women understand their legal options when family members abuse their trust. It's hard work. Hearing their stories feels like reliving my own, but it's also healing, turning my pain into purpose. And I found my tribe. Not a family I was born into or obligated to maintain. A family I chose, women like me who'd been betrayed, discarded, underestimated. We meet every other week for dinner at a local diner called Mountain View. We laugh in a way that feels sacred, like we're reclaiming something that was stolen. We celebrate small victories, someone standing up to their abuser, someone filing for divorce, someone getting their own apartment. We hold each other through the hard days. Annie visits me once a month. She drives up from Phoenix, 3 hours each way, usually with baked goods and stories about her life. She's applying to colleges now, and she says she wants to study social work, to help people like me. She's been accepted to Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff with a partial scholarship. She might live with me while she goes to school. The mother-in-law suite is small, but we could make it work. The idea fills me with a joy I thought I'd lost forever. David sends a birthday card every year, generic ones from the drugstore with pre-printed messages about gratitude and love. To a wonderful mother, surrounded by flowers and butterflies. He signs them David and Sarah, like they're a unit that absorbed my son and replaced him with someone I don't recognize. There's never a return address, just a Phoenix postmark. I send them back unopened. Every single one marked Return to Sender. Some people might call that petty. I call it boundary setting. My life now is smaller, but truer. I have less money, less space, less of everything I thought mattered. My entire life fits in 3 rooms now. But I have something David can never take from me. I have myself back. I make my own decisions. I choose how to spend my time, my energy, my remaining years. And that freedom, that autonomy, is worth more than any house. The peace I feel isn't about forgiveness. I haven't forgiven him, and I'm not sure I ever will. People ask me about that sometimes, the book club ladies, the women at the shelter. Have you forgiven your son? As if forgiveness is required for healing. As if I owe him absolution. It's about acceptance. Accepting that some people will use your love as a weapon. That blood relation doesn't guarantee loyalty. That you can do everything right and still lose everything. But you can also rebuild. Different. Quieter. Real. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. Something that might save you or someone you love from walking the path I did. Financial abuse is insidious because it hides behind family obligations and cultural expectations. We're taught that good parents sacrifice for their children, that we should trust family above all else, and those beliefs become weapons in the hands of people willing to exploit them. Here's what I wish I'd known at 56. What I wish someone had told me before I signed those papers, before I mortgaged my future on the promise of family loyalty. First, never co-sign or provide collateral for anyone, even your children, unless you can afford to lose it entirely. I know that sounds harsh. I know it feels like you're not trusting them. But trust should never require financial suicide. Real love doesn't demand you risk your security to prove your devotion. Second, keep your assets separate and protected. I should have put my house in a trust. I should have consulted a financial advisor instead of relying on David's promises. There are legal tools designed specifically to protect aging parents from financial exploitation. Use them. It's not about being suspicious, it's about being smart. Third, document everything. Every conversation about money, every agreement, every change to legal documents. I kept assuming family operated on good faith and verbal understandings. But when things went wrong, I had nothing to prove what had been promised versus what had been delivered. If I hadn't started that notebook, if Annie hadn't saved those screenshots, I would have had no case at all. Fourth, maintain your own support network outside of your children. I'd become so focused on David that I'd let other relationships atrophy. My friends drifted away because I was always too busy helping him. My siblings got tired of hearing me talk about his success. When the betrayal came, I was isolated, alone. Exactly where financial abusers want you. And finally, know the warning signs. When someone starts making decisions about your life without your input, when they control your access to information about your own finances, when they isolate you from people who might question their narrative, when they suggest you're too old, too confused, too whatever to manage your own affairs. These are red flags, not concerns, not misunderstandings, actual, legitimate red flags that require immediate action. There are resources out there. The National Center on Elder Abuse has a hotline, 1-800-677-1116. Adult Protective Services exists in every state. Elder law attorneys often offer free consultations. You are not alone, even when it feels like you are. I also learned that speaking up is terrifying, but necessary. The shame I felt kept me silent for so long. I didn't want people to know my son had done this to me. I didn't want to admit I'd been that gullible, that trusting, that wrong. I was embarrassed, humiliated. I felt like I'd failed as a mother. How could I have raised someone capable of this? But silence protects abusers. It allows them to continue hurting people while their victims suffer in isolation. So I started talking. At the women's shelter where I volunteer. At community meetings. I told my story, and you know what happened? Other women started telling theirs. Mothers whose sons had drained their savings. Fathers whose daughters had taken power of attorney and emptied their accounts. Grandparents who'd been systematically erased from family decisions while their assets were carved up by relatives. We were everywhere, hidden, ashamed, afraid to speak because we'd be blamed for trusting family. But we weren't to blame. The betrayers were. And by speaking up, we started to shift that narrative. If you're listening to this and recognizing patterns in your own life, please understand something. It's not your fault. You didn't cause this by being too trusting or too loving. You were targeted because you had those qualities and someone decided to exploit them. That's on them, not you. And it's not too late to protect yourself. Even if you've already signed documents, even if you've already given money, even if the damage feels irreversible. Talk to a lawyer who specializes in elder law. Contact your local area agency on aging. Find a support group. Take one small step toward reclaiming your power. Because you matter, your security matters, your future matters, and no one, not even your own children, has the right to steal that from you in the name of family love. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I know it wasn't easy to hear. It wasn't easy to live either. But I hope something in my experience resonates with you. Maybe it validates something you've been feeling. Maybe it warns you away from a path you were considering. Maybe it just reminds you that you're not alone in whatever struggle you're facing. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your world. Are you having your morning coffee while I share my evening reflections? Are you driving home from work, looking for company in the commute? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your perspectives help me understand how these stories land in different lives. If this story connected with you, if it made you feel something or think something or recognize something in your own life, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button. It helps other people find these stories, people who might need to hear them as much as you did. And please, leave a comment telling me what you would have done in my place. Would you have fought in court? Would you have walked away sooner? Would you have confronted David differently? I'm genuinely curious because every person brings their own wisdom to these situations, and I learn from your insights. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I share new stories of resilience, betrayal, and survival every week. Real stories from real people navigating the complicated messiness of family, love, and human relationships. I'd also recommend watching 2 other stories from the channel if you found this one meaningful. The first is about a woman whose husband tried to have her declared incompetent to take her inheritance. The second is about a father whose children staged an intervention to put him in a nursing home while they sold his possessions. Both of these stories explore similar themes of family exploitation and the courage it takes to fight back. Until the next story, take care of your heart, protect your peace, and remember that your worth isn't determined by how others choose to value you. It's determined by how you choose to value yourself. I'm Margaret, and this was my story of betrayal, loss, and the unexpected freedom that comes from letting go of people who never really held you to begin with. Take care.